Aaron adjusted the camera on his shoulder, squinting against the dying light of the late afternoon. The asylum loomed ahead like a wound in the landscape, its jagged silhouette stark against the orange sky. Blackwood Haven, the plaque at the gate read, though most of the lettering had corroded with time. A weathered chain hung from the rusted gate, broken and bent as if someone or something had forced it open years ago. This was the job, one of many in a long line underpaid gigs. Aaron didn't mind. Documenting old, abandoned buildings had its perks, especially for someone like him who thrived on the eerie beauty of decay. There was always something poetic about crumbling walls and empty hallways, the whispers of stories they might hold. Or so he told himself. But Blackwood Haven wasn't poetic. It was infamous. 50 years ago, the place had been a state of the Art Mental Health Facility. At least, that's what the brochures had claimed. In reality, it was a glorified prison for the unwanted, the mentally ill, the homeless, those who didn't fit society's mold. Rumors of abuse and human experimentation had swirled long before the mass disappearance of its patients and staff in 1978. No bodies were ever found. Just an empty building with rooms coated in claw marks and walls filled with carvings that no one could decipher. Aaron wasn't here for the history lesson. He was here because some paranormal group had hired him to shoot atmospheric footage for their next video. And because he needed rent money, piece of cake, he muttered to himself, stepping through the gate. The gravel crunched under his boots, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. No birds, no wind, no distant hum of traffic. Just silence, heavy and oppressive. He filmed the exterior first, panning slowly to capture the fractured windows and ivy crawling up the cracked facade. It was the kind of shot that would look great in post-production with a creepy filter slapped on. His clients would love it. As he moved closer to the entrance, the silence deepened, pressing against his ears like cotton. He paused, glancing over his shoulder. The gate stood open behind him, the horizon burning in the last light of day. For a moment, he considered heading back to his car, just to check the equipment one more time. Maybe wait for morning to do the interior shots. Then the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint sound. Aaron froze, holding his breath. It was almost too soft to hear, but it was there, whispering, just at the edge of perception. He shook it off. Probably the wind, he said aloud, his voice too loud in the quiet. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. The double doors groaned as he pushed them open, revealing a cavernous lobby. Dust motes floated in the weak beam of his flashlight, which barely cut through the gloom. The air was thick, stale, and tinged with a faint metallic scent. Blood? No, just his imagination. Aaron lifted the camera and hit record. The asylum swallowed him, whole as soon as he crossed the threshold. Aaron's footsteps echoed across the warped tiles of the lobby floor, the sound bouncing back unnaturally, as if the space were much larger than it seemed. The flashlight's beam jittered slightly, casting twisted shadows along the cracked walls. It was colder inside than it should have been, the kind of damp chill that seeped into your bones and refused to leave. Atmospheric as hell, he muttered, more to himself than anything else. The words didn't carry far. It felt like they were absorbed into the walls before they could travel. Aaron swung the camera across the room, catching the skeletal remains of what had once been a reception desk. Behind it, rows of filing cabinets sagged under the weight of rust and mold. Above, the remains of a chandelier hung precariously from a cracked ceiling, its once glittering crystals dulled and smeared with grime. The whispers started again, faint, almost indistinguishable from the creaks of the old building settling. Aaron turned sharply, flashlight following his gaze. But there was nothing, only empty space and the silence rushing back to fill it. Could be the wind, he muttered, though his voice was tight. He'd heard enough ghost stories in his line of work to know what to ignore and what to take seriously. Still, this place had a weight to it, like the air itself was watching him. He shook it off and pressed forward. The camera was rolling, its tiny red light glowing reassuringly in the dark. Aaron kept it trained on the long corridor ahead, where peeling wallpaper clung stubbornly to the walls. The floor was littered with debris, shattered glass, fragments of old medical equipment, and what looked suspiciously like bone. He bent down, shining the flashlight on the object. It wasn't bone, just a fragment of wood, its jagged edges weathered with age. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Getting jumpy already," he said, forcing a chuckle. The first strange thing appeared when he reached the end of the hallway. There, carved into the wall, was a symbol. It was rough, as if scratched in with a blunt tool, and it wasn't like anything Aaron had seen before. A circle bisected by a jagged line, with smaller shapes radiating outward in an almost hypnotic pattern. He tilted the camera to get a better shot, zooming in on the carving. As he did, the whispers grew louder. His flashlight flickered. Aaron froze, suddenly hyper, aware of how empty the asylum was. The whispers weren't random. They almost sounded like words now. Though he couldn't make them out, he stood there, holding his breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The light steadied. The whispers faded. He let out a shaky laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. Okay, that was weird. He straightened up, panning the camera back down the hallway, and almost missed it. A flicker of movement in the corner of the screen. He swung the camera back, his heart pounding. The flashlight followed, illuminating the hallway. Nothing, just the symbol, carved into the wall like it had been waiting for him. Aaron hesitated. Every instinct told him to leave, to walk back down the hallway, get in his car, and never look back. But that wasn't an option. Not with rent overdue and this gig promising a decent paycheck. Just the camera glitching, he told himself, though the words felt hollow. He pressed forward, deeper into the asylum. The deeper Aaron went, the stranger things became. The corridors seemed to stretch longer than they should have. The walls narrowing in a way that made him feel like the building was alive and breathing around him. His flashlight flickered sporadically, plunging him into darkness for agonizing seconds before flaring back to life. The carvings on the walls became more frequent, different symbols now, each one more intricate than the last. Some were smeared with what looked like dried blood, their edges jagged and uneven. Others seemed almost fresh, as if someone, or something, had etched them recently. Aaron tried not to think about it. He entered a larger room what might have once been a common area. The remnants of chairs and tables were scattered across the floor, along with piles of shredded fabric that might have been curtains or clothing. He swung the camera around the room, capturing the eerie stillness. Then he saw it, a figure. It was standing in the far corner of the room, barely visible in the weak glow of his flashlight. Aaron froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure was wrong, its proportions too long, its arms hanging unnaturally at its sides. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Aaron could feel its gaze piercing him. He backed away slowly, keeping the camera trained on the thing. His flashlight flickered, and in the split second of darkness, the figure was gone. "Nope," Aaron whispered, his voice trembling. But even as he turned to leave, something compelled him to stay. The whispers returned, louder now, insistent. They seemed to come from all around him, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of pleading voices. "Help us, help us." Aaron froze. The words were clear this time, cutting through the haze of fear. He turned back toward the room, the camera still rolling. The figure was gone, but the whispers remained, filling the air with a desperate energy. "Help us," they repeated, the voices layering over each other. Aaron didn't know what to do. He'd come here to document an old building, to take some creepy footage and call it a day. He hadn't signed up for whatever this was. But the voices wouldn't stop. "Fine," his voice shaky. "Fine, I'll help. Just tell me what you want." The whispers faded, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, as if in response, the floor beneath him groaned. Aaron stumbled backward as a section of tiles collapsed, revealing a dark, gaping hole. From the depths of the hole came a sound, a low, guttural noise that sent chills down his spine. Aaron aimed the flashlight at the hole, his hands trembling. Something moved in the darkness. Aaron's breathing was shallow, each inhale catching in his throat as he peered into the jagged hole that had torn through the floor. The flashlight's weak beam couldn't penetrate the abyss. It was like staring into nothingness, an unnatural void that seemed to absorb the light and the air around it. And then it moved again. A sound rose from the depths, faint at first, like the scratching of nails against wood. It grew louder, more frantic, as if something was clawing its way up toward him. Aaron's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet stayed rooted in place. His hands gripped the camera tighter, its recording light blinking steadily as if it too were staring into the hole. The whispers returned, faint but insistent. "Help us, help us." I don't know how," Aaron whispered back, his voice trembling. The sound of his own voice startled him, breaking the spell. He staggered backward, away from the edge of the hole, but not far enough to leave the room. The scraping stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then a hand shot out of the darkness. Aaron barely had time to process it before the flashlight beam illuminated the pale, withered limb. Its fingers were impossibly long, the nails cracked and jagged. The skin was gray and mottled, stretched too tightly over the bones beneath. The hand clawed at the edge of the hole, pulling up something that made Aaron's stomach twist. A head emerged next, followed by a torso. It was humanoid, but wrong in every conceivable way. Its face was blank, a smooth expanse of flesh where eyes, nose, and a mouth should have been. Its body moved unnaturally, joints bending in ways they shouldn't as it climbed out of the void. Aaron stumbled back further, the flashlight shaking in his grip. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a cacophony of desperate pleas. The creature stood fully now, its head cocked to one side as if studying him. It didn't have eyes, but Aaron could feel its attention fixed on him. The camera's screen flickered, the image distorting as if the creature's very presence disrupted reality. Aaron's instincts finally kicked in. He turned and bolted, careening out of the room and back into the hallway. His boots skidded on the debris-strewn floor as he ran, the whispers chasing him, growing louder with every step. His flashlight flickered wildly, plunging him into brief pockets of darkness before flaring back to life. He didn't dare look back. Aaron turned a corner and slammed into a door, his shoulder jarring painfully against the wood. He fumbled for the handle, yanking it open and stumbling inside. Slamming the door shut behind him, he pressed his back against it, panting. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. He swept the flashlight around the room, taking in his surroundings. It looked like an old office. A rusted desk sat against one wall, its surface cluttered with faded papers and broken glass. Shelves lined the opposite wall, their contents long since destroyed by time and decay. Aaron's hands shook as he adjusted the camera, angling it toward the desk. The papers were covered in spidery handwriting, too faded to read. But one page caught his attention. It was a sketch, a crude drawing of the same symbol he'd seen carved into the hallway walls. Beneath it were words scrawled in large, jagged letters. Do not listen, do not touch. Great advice, his voice barely above a whisper. He stuffed the paper into his pocket, unsure why but unwilling to leave it behind. The shelves drew his attention next. Most of the objects were unremarkable. Broken tools, shattered jars, and books with their spines warped by moisture. But tucked away in the corner was something different, a small black box. It was about the size of a jewelry case, its surface covered in the same intricate carvings that adorned the asylum walls. Aaron hesitated. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to leave it alone, but the whispers returned, faint and coaxing, urging him forward. Help us, they repeated, softer now, almost pleading. He reached out and picked up the box. It was heavier than it looked, its surface cold to the touch. The carving seemed to shift under his fingers, writhing like living things. A sudden wave of nausea washed over him, and the room seemed to tilt. Aaron stumbled, clutching the box tightly. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he was somewhere else. The office dissolved, replaced by a vast, empty expanse of darkness. Shadows swirled around him, and in the distance, he could see faint, flickering lights, like dying stars. The whispers were all around him now, louder than ever. Help us, they demanded. Free us. Aaron gasped as the vision ended, the office snapping back into focus. He dropped the box onto the desk, his hands trembling violently. The whispers had stopped again, but the air felt heavier, charged with a malevolent energy. What the hell is happening? He whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. Slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to a human. Aaron's blood ran cold. He turned off the flashlight, plunging himself into darkness. His heart hammered in his chest as he crouched behind the desk, clutching the camera like a lifeline. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Something scraped against the door, a low growl rumbling from the other side. Aaron's mind raced. The creature from the hole, it had followed him. The doorknob rattled. Aaron bit down on his hand to stifle a gasp. He could hear it breathing now, a wet, guttural sound that sent chills down his spine. The door groaned as it began to splinter, whatever was outside forcing its way in. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. Aaron didn't move. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, before he finally dared to peek over the edge of the desk. The door was intact, the hallway beyond quiet and empty, but something had changed. The air was thicker now, almost suffocating, and the walls seemed to pulse faintly, as if they were alive. He had to get out. Clutching the camera, Aaron crept toward the door. He opened it slowly, wincing at the creak of the hinges. The hallway stretched out before him, impossibly long and unfamiliar. He could have sworn this wasn't the same corridor he'd come down earlier. The asylum was changing. Aaron stepped into the hallway, his legs shaking beneath him. The air felt heavier with each step, pressing against his chest like an invisible weight. His flashlight flickered weakly, casting jittery shadows that danced along the walls. The carvings were everywhere now, spiraling up to the ceiling and running down the floors, itched with a frantic energy. Some symbols seemed to glow faintly, pulsating in time with his own racing heartbeat. The whispers returned, softer this time, almost mournful. They didn't speak words now, just a low, keening sound that made Aaron's stomach churn. He checked the camera screen. The feed was distorted, static crawling across the edges, but he could still make out the hallway ahead. As he moved forward, the distortion grew worse. Every few seconds, a shadow would flicker across the screen, darting from one side of the corridor to the other, too fast for him to see with the naked eye. Aaron swallowed hard. "This is fine," he whispered to himself. His voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the endless corridor. "Just keep moving." One foot in front of the other. The hallway opened up into another room, this one larger than the others he'd passed. A tarnished plate by the door read, "Dr. Victor Thorne, Chief Administrator." Aaron hesitated. The whispers seemed louder here, almost urgent, like a warning. But something about the room drew him in, like a hook buried deep in his mind. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was unnervingly intact, as if the years of decay and abandonment had stopped at its threshold. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface pristine except for a single object, a worn leather journal. Behind the desk, shelves lined with dusty books loomed high, their spines stamped with medical jargon and strange symbols. Aaron approached the desk, his fingers brushing the edge of the journal. He hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to leave it alone, but the whispers swirled around him, insistent. Opening the journal felt like breaking a seal. The air in the room grew colder, and the faint scent of antiseptic and rot wafted up from the pages. The handwriting inside was jagged, almost frenzied, but legible. Journal of Dr. Victor Thorne, entry number 193. The experiments continue. The bridging process is imperfect. but progress has been made. The patient's souls resist the crossing, clinging stubbornly to their mortal vessels. But I am close, so very close. The artifact is the key. It whispers to me, shows me the way. The others cannot hear it, but I can. It speaks of a realm beyond this one, a place of endless potential. If only they understood the sacrifices required for greatness. The failures, they haunt the walls now. Their voice is a constant reminder of my shortcomings, but their suffering is not in vain. Each one brings me closer to the truth. Soon the bridge will open, and I will cross. Aaron slammed the journal shut, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The room felt wrong now, the shadows stretching unnaturally long, curling toward him like grasping hands. The whispers turned angry, hissing in his ears. He grabbed the camera and turned to leave. But the door slammed shut on its own, the sound reverberating through the room. Aaron spun around, heart pounding. The shadows were moving now, wraithing like living things. They pooled in the corners, rising and taking shape. Figures emerged, humanoid but twisted. Their faces were contorted in silent screams, their forms flickering like bad static. Aaron stumbled backward, clutching the camera like a shield. The largest figure stepped forward, its hollow eyes boring into him. When it spoke, its voice was a distorted echo, layered with dozens of others. You should not be here. Aaron's legs gave out, and he collapsed to the floor. I didn't mean to. He stammered, but the figure cut him off. Leave, or you will join us. The words sent a shiver down his spine. Aaron scrambled to his feet, fumbling with the door handle. It wouldn't budge. The shadows closed in, their forms shifting and twisting around him, blocking out the light. Help us, another voice whispered, this one softer, more pleading. It came from the desk, where the journal sat open again, its pages flipping wildly on their own. The carvings on the walls began to glow, the symbols pulsating faster and faster, their light blinding. Aaron did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed the journal, clutching it to his chest. As the shadows lunged at him, the world twisted around him. For a moment, everything was wrong. The walls bent inward, the floor dropped out from under him, and the air felt thick, like water. Aaron squeezed his eyes shut, clutching the journal as the whispers screamed in his ears. When he opened his eyes again, he was back in the hallway. The asylum was silent now. The oppressive weight in the air was gone, and the symbols on the walls no longer glowed. Aaron staggered forward, his legs barely holding him up. His flashlight was dead, the bulb shattered, but the faint glow from the camera screen gave him just enough light to see. He didn't know how much time had passed, but he knew one thing: he had to get out. The hallways stretched endlessly before him, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. Rooms he'd passed earlier were gone, replaced by new ones, their doors ajar as if inviting him inside. He ignored them, forcing himself to keep moving. The whispers were gone, but the silence was almost worse. It pressed down on him, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing. Finally, he saw it, the front door. It stood open, the night air beyond beckoning him like a lifeline. Aaron broke into a run, ignoring the way the walls seemed to close in around him, the shadows flickering at the edges of his vision. He burst through the door and into the open air, collapsing onto the gravel outside. For a long moment, He just lay there, staring up at the night sky, the stars blurry through his tears. Aaron didn't stop driving until he was miles away from Blackwood Haven. The journal sat on the passenger seat, its presence a constant weight in his mind. He didn't want to open it again, but he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. When he finally pulled over, he grabbed the camera and rewound the footage. His hands trembled as he watched the video. Each frame a reminder of the nightmare he'd just escaped. But the video wasn't what he expected. The footage showed Aaron walking through the asylum, but the shadows were wrong. In every shot, there were figures behind him, just out of focus. The carvings on the walls glowed faintly, even when his flashlight didn't. And then, in the final frame, Aaron stopped and turned toward the camera. His face filled the screen, but it wasn't his face. The eyes were empty, the skin pale and stretched too tight. The Aaron on the screen smiled, a slow, unnatural grin. The screen went black. Aaron sat there, staring at the blank screen, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He looked at the journal, its pages fluttering in a breeze that shouldn't have been there. From somewhere in the darkness, the whispers started again. "Help us." Aaron sat frozen in his car, the camera screen still blank but radiating an unnatural heat. The whispering continued, faint but unmistakable, curling through the edges of his mind like smoke. He glanced at the journal beside him, the brittle pages moving as if turned by invisible hands. He had left Blackwood Haven behind, but it hadn't let him go. "Help us." The words were clearer now, sharper. They weren't coming from the journal or the camera. They were inside his head. "No." Aaron whispered, his voice trembling. "No, I'm done. I'm not going back." But the whispering grew louder, taking on new layers, new voices. Some sounded desperate, pleading. Others were angry, accusing. He pressed his palms against his ears, but it didn't stop. The voices overlapped, rising into a chorus that made his skull throb. "You left us. You took it. You must fix this." Aaron grabbed the journal and hurled it into the passenger footwell. The whispers didn't stop. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat reverberating like a drum, and he could feel something. No, someone watching him. He reached for the camera, desperate to prove to himself that this was all in his head, that there was some logical explanation. He rewound the footage again, skipping past the earlier parts. His shaky hands stopped at the final clip, the one that showed his twisted face grinning back at him. He hesitated, then pressed play. The video began to glitch almost immediately, the screen filling with static and distorted images. There was no sound, just a faint, high-pitched hum. But then the picture stabilized, and Aaron saw something new. The camera was no longer filming him. It was filming the asylum. The footage showed the hallway he had just escaped from. But the carvings on the walls glowed brighter now, pulsating like living veins. Shadows right across the floor, moving with a purpose. The camera moved on its own, panning toward a door that Aaron hadn't noticed when he'd been inside. The door was carved with symbols far more intricate than the others. They seemed to move, twisting and changing as the camera focused on them. Slowly, the door creaked open, revealing darkness beyond. Aaron stopped the video, his chest tightening with panic. He hadn't seen that door. He hadn't filmed that door. The whispers surged, louder now, deafening. Bring it back. The voices demanded, bring it back, or we'll bring you. The air inside the car turned frigid. Frost spread across the windshield, the condensation crystallizing into the same strange symbols that had lined the asylum walls. Aaron's breath fog in the cold as the whispers reached a fever pitch, blending together into a single inhuman wail. He grabbed the camera and threw it into the backseat, as if putting distance between himself and the cursed device would help. But the whispers didn't stop. They were part of him now, echoing inside his mind. His phone buzzed on the dashboard, the screen lighting up with a call. The number was unlisted, but the ringtone, a simple melody, sounded warped and distorted, like it was coming from a broken speaker. Against his better judgment, Aaron answered. The line crackled with static. At first, there was no voice, just the faint hiss of dead air. Then, a single word came through, clear and sharp. Return. Aaron's blood ran cold. His grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? What do you want from me? The static grew louder, drowning out his voice. The word repeated over and over, each time more forceful. Return. The call ended abruptly, the screen going dark. Aaron stared at the phone, his hands trembling. He felt something shift in the air around him, a presence settling in the small space of the car. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror. For a moment, there was nothing, just the empty back seat, bathed in the dim light of the street lamp outside. But then, the shadows shifted. A figure sat in the back seat, its face hidden in darkness, its outline barely visible. Aaron's heart stopped, his throat tightened, and he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Bring it back, the figure whispered, its voice overlapping with the others. Or you will stay with us. Aaron bolted from the car, stumbling onto the side of the road. The cold night air hit him like a slap, but he didn't stop. He ran, his feet pounding against the asphalt, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he couldn't stay. He didn't remember turning the car around, but at some point, he found himself driving back toward the asylum. The road stretched endlessly before him, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Blackwood Haven came into view, its jagged silhouette looming against the night sky. Aaron's headlights illuminated the broken gate, the rusted chain hanging loosely. The asylum seemed alive now, the windows glowing faintly, as if lit from within. Aaron parked the car and stepped out, clutching the journal and the camera. The whispers surrounded him immediately, rising and falling like the tide. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made his skin crawl. He stepped through the gate, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. The asylum loomed ahead, its dark maw open and waiting. Aaron hesitated at the entrance, his stomach twisting with dread. The whispers grew louder, urging him forward. Return. He stepped inside. The interior of the asylum had changed. The walls were pulsating now, their surfaces covered in glowing veins that pulsed like a heartbeat. The symbols were everywhere, shifting and writhing, their light casting eerie shadows across the floor. Aaron followed the path laid out for him, his feet moving as if guided by an unseen force. The camera in his hand felt heavier with each step, and the journal's pages flipped wildly as if caught in a storm. He reached the door from the video. It stood at the end of a long hallway, its surface alive with shifting symbols. The whispers were deafening now, their voices blending into an otherworldly hum. Aaron approached the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. The moment his fingers touched it, the door swung open on its own, revealing the darkness beyond. The artifact sat in the center of the room, glowing faintly. Shadows swirled around it, twisting and merging into humanoid shapes. The figures from before emerged, their blank faces turned toward him. "Free us," they demanded. "Finish what he started." Aaron didn't know what they meant, but he knew one thing: the artifact had to be destroyed. He raised the camera, aiming it at the artifact, and hit record. The shadows surged toward him, their voices rising into a deafening scream. Aaron screamed back, hurling the journal at the artifact. The moment the two objects touched, the room exploded with light. Authorities found the camera 2 weeks later, sitting in the middle of an empty field where Blackwood Haven had once stood. The asylum was gone, leaving nothing behind but scorched earth. The camera's footage showed Aaron standing in the room, surrounded by shadows. He held the journal and the artifact, his face twisted with determination. As the light consumed the room, he looked directly into the lens and whispered, "I'm sorry." The screen went black. Aaron was never seen again.